Andor is a show that I was not really looking forward to. For one, because I think one of the problems of Rogue One, this is something that many people have discussed before, is that the characters aren't all that interesting. Don't get me wrong, there's some characters I really like, especially Chirrut Imwe and K2SO, but a good amount of the characters just aren't that memorable in Rogue One. They're not that distinctive or kind of forgettable. In fact, I think if you ask people to name all the main characters from Rogue One, all the main heroes, they might be able to remember some of the names, but I feel like a lot of people would struggle to name all the characters without looking them up. And I didn't think Cassian Andor was all that interesting in Rogue One. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate how Cassian's character was our first glimpse into a more morally gray side of the rebellion, which is something that we don't see in the original trilogy. But not only do I think Cassian Andor was kind of forgettable in Rogue One, he's also not the number one main character. I mean, you can argue that he's the co lead, sure, but he's not actually the main character of that movie. Plus, Andor is set in the original trilogy era, meaning between Star Wars Revenge of the Sith and Star Wars A New Hope. This led me to be not very excited for this show because one of my pet peeves with the franchise as a whole, looking at the bigger picture, is that Star Wars has been boxed in so much to this very small, narrow window of time between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, which is just not a lot of time at all, especially when you think about the lore. In fact, even more than that, the time period between Attack of the Clones and A New Hope has been explored so much. I just want Star Wars to move away from having stories set in the same time period or dealing with similar characters. I just want Star Wars to actually be creative for once, have a story that's set in a completely different time period with new characters that's not about the Empire versus the Rebellion, it's not about Jedi versus the Sith. There's so much potential, but that potential is unfortunately just not being taken advantage of. Going back to Andor, however, one of the reasons I wasn't very excited about this show is that, this is another piece of content set in the original trilogy era, which has been explored a ton. I mean, now we have Kenobi, Bad Batch, Andor, as well as Rebels. And then there's Rogue One and Solo. All six of these movies slash TV shows are set in the exact same time period. Don't get me wrong, they're not all taking place at literally the exact same time. No, that's not it. But they're all taking place in the same general time period. They're taking place in the same 19-year window of time. Before this show came out, when I heard about how Disney was going to be doing a Cassian Andor show, I was just thinking, really? A Cassian Andor show of all things? Why make a show about that character? Especially because we already know from Rogue One where his story ends. And then the other main character in the show is Mon Mothma, another character that we know that another case of us knowing where this character's story is heading because Mon Mothma appears in Return of the Jedi as well as other pieces of content set in the original trilogy era. So I was not particularly excited for Andor, but even though looking at the bigger picture, I still really, really want Star Wars to get more creative, to stop boxing itself in so much. I have really been enjoying Andor. Yes, when compared to other Star Wars shows like The Mandalorian, Andor is not as flashy. It doesn't pop as much because it doesn't have an abundance of cameos. It doesn't rely on nostalgia as a crutch. It doesn't rely on familiar Star Wars imagery like the Death Star, AT-ATs, Star Destroyers, TIE Fighters, X-Wings, all lightsabers, Jedi, Sith, all these Star Wars elements that are immediately recognizable to a lot of people, even people who don't actually know Star Wars as well. But even though Andor isn't really as immediately or obviously memorable as a show like Mandalorian, especially when you look at Mandalorian Season 2, which has a bunch of familiar and in some cases very iconic Star Wars characters in it. I feel like Andor is a show that is more mature, more sophisticated, and better written. What I mean when I say more sophisticated is that I feel like Andor has more layers to it, more nuance, it's more complex. I really have been surprised by how, unlike Kenobi or Book of Boba Fett, Andor has not been simplistic. It hasn't been shallow or one dimensional. No, this is a more complex show, and I also really appreciate how this show has been taking its time. I think a good way to describe this show is that it is a slow burn, and I appreciate how this show places trust in its audience to follow along. It doesn't feel like it needs to have a ton of cameos or a ton of action to keep its audience watching.